Welcome, everyone. This is Jeff Rich from the Burning Archive. One of the funny things that's happening at the moment in world affairs is that our stories about world history are starting not to make sense anymore. We've all grown up with certain assumptions about the rise of the West and a very Euro-American centred account of world history. When I say we've all grown up, it's not entirely true, of course, because most of us don't live in Europe or North America. People live in across Eurasia, Africa, Asia, even remote places like Australia. And the accounts of world history don't really give an equal and balanced account of all parts of the world. And as a result, the stories we tell about the rise and fall of global empires also don't really make sense. This has even got European and American leaders into trouble. Joseph Borrell, for example, referred to Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. And in that, he was just reiterating the sort of perspective of American foreign policy thinkers like Robert Kagan. But these kind of stories of the world are really based on a false history of the rise and fall of global empires. And there is an easy antidote to that because there is so much good quality world history out there at the moment. And that's what I try to share with you here on the Burning Archive. And the best single book I have recommended to sort of make better sense of what is really going on in the world right now, to make sense of geopolitics, if you like, is John Darwin's After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires, 1400 to 2000. It's a book from, I think, 2008. Prize-winning book, incredibly influential, and a superb synthesis based on all his work writing, of course, to marvellous histories of the British Empire and studying globalisation as it has changed over centuries. And John Darwin's book, as does most contemporary world history, really tells a different story to the conventional account of the rise of the West, the sort of, the Westphalian world order and all that sort of thing, American hegemony and the rest of it. And in this video, I'm going to outline the basic narrative outlined in John Darwin's book about the rise and fall of global empires from 1400 to 1600. My aim is to present a simple summary form of this story so that you can dive deeper into it if you want to. Of course, there are many different interpretations and lots of details that if you want to, you can dive deeper into. And one way to do that is to join me at jeffrich.substack, where I write a weekly newsletter about world history and world affairs, and offer deeper dives into aspects of world history, including an upcoming series on the post-1945 world described in John Darwin's book After Tamerlane. With all the arguments one way or the other, I think if you get this simple alternative account of world history under your belt, then you'll have a lot more ability to sort of think independently about world affairs when people start talking about world orders and hegemons and Western civilization and the story of the relative power of different, countries, great powers, civilizations, if you will, around the world. And it is Darwin's account is a broadly accepted account, I think, that is much more soundly based than, for example, the work of Yuval Noah Harari or Neil Ferguson, or certainly better than many of the very, very popular YouTube history and geopolitics channels out on the internet. So in his book, John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires 1400 to 2000, there are really 7 periods that stretch from 1400, when the world conqueror Timur the Lame, the great Central Asian successor to Genghis Khan, was besieging Damascus and conversing with the great Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun. And he takes the story from that moment where there was one ruler who thought he could control all of Eurasia and therefore control the world. And he takes the story all the way up to 2000 when another power, America, thought it could control Eurasia and control the world, that it was the unipolar power, the hyperpower, the world hegemon at the era of American primacy, which I guess is what is collapsing today and is why people are searching for new ways of telling the story of the world. So the first period is Eurasia and the Age of Discovery, which is broadly from 1400 to 1600. And he begins really the story by talking about how there is, I guess, the old world of Eurasia, Europe, Africa, and Asia, all the way from however you define it, let's say Turkey to China, including, of course, the huge expanse of northern Eurasia that is Russia. And, of course, there's the New World, the Americas, that is discovered by the Europeans in the late 1400s. But the old world of Eurasia has three roughly evenly balanced regions of Europe, I guess the Islamic centre, and East Asia. And the remarkable thing about this story is, although this period sees what John Darwin calls the Occidental breakout led by Spain and Portugal, the discovery of Americas, Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, it is still a relatively evenly balanced world. There is a very strong counterpoised Islamic powers in the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Iran and Mughal India. In many ways, India is actually the wealthy centre, the workshop of the world. And there is also a period of great consolidation in East Asia with the Ming and the Manchu and the Tokugawa empires. But Europe does develop in this era, in the Age of Discovery, a comparative advantage in marine technology, which, given its ability to then transport people around the world, it, changes the processes of globalization that are occurring around the world. But it is still a very weak projection, I guess, of European power, wealth, authority around the world. The second era is really the early modern equilibrium between 1600 and 1750. After the great outbreak of Europe into the Americas and to some degree sort of weak little outposts in Asia, like the coastal ports of India and in some sort of exchanges with China, there is a gradual change in Europe's relations with the world, a much more slowed down development of Europe, and the limits to their ambition in the wider world. Now, it's interesting that the early modern equilibrium is the period 1600 to 1750, during which the Treaty of Westphalia from 1648 or 1649, I can never quite remember, occurs, and where people often describe that as the foundation of world order. The Treaty of Westphalia, I don't think really even gets a mention in John Darwin's book, but there is a period of, I guess, consolidation of power structures of the state, of the ancien regime in Europe. But at the same time, there is an enormous, what John Darwin calls the inland imperialism from Russia. Russia expands from, really from about, I guess, the 1400s, the late 1400s, and certainly under Ivan Grozny, Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible of Russia, in the mid-1500s, it really starts to expand, both south, taking over Kazan and into Siberia. But under Peter the Great, this inland imperialism greatly strengthens, and Russia forms a great Eurasian power, which has a complicated relationship with Western Europe. But in East Asia too, there is the Tokugawa and Manchu dynasties, the great Emperor Kangxi, and within the Islamic centre of Eurasia, there are strains with Ottoman setbacks, wealthy Mughal India, Maratha Confederacy, and the beginning of European military power projection into India. But of course, one of the great changes, of course, is the incorporation of the New World of the Americas, with dramatic changes around the world. But again, it is a early modern equilibrium. It is not the European domination of the world. And then the third period is the Eurasian Revolution between 1750 and 1830. And here, this, I guess, is the era of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, which I think is called something else like the French Indian War in the United States of America. And it is, many people regard it as the First World War, the first genuinely global conflict in which some of the powers in Europe are fighting each other with consequences around the world. And in this era, there are some big events, and it's the start of what John Darwin calls the Eurasian Revolution. A geopolitical revolution, an economic revolution, and a cultural revolution as well. The geopolitical revolution, in part, relates to the break-up of the sort of balance of power system in Europe under the Treaty of Westphalia, guaranteed in many ways by the French. This system really breaks up in the 1750s. And then, of course, there is a political revolution in France that sort of flows on to Napoleonic Wars that become genuinely global wars. Captain Cook explores the world and particularly explores and maps the Pacific, and then Australia enters in a new way the story of world history. And this is a huge region of the world that really opens up and becomes navigable and changes the nature of the world. There is what one historian called the Great Divergence, the relative advantage of Europe in certain industrial economies, which he discusses to some degree. But even at this point, it is not like a lay-down misere for the European and North American powers. But there is a growing sense of cultural self-confidence coming from Europe, and the emergence of increasingly hierarchical views about the relative merits of civilizations around the world. And this really takes us to really the point of 1830, which is really perhaps the critical time when there really is a breakout of European and American, Euro-American power across the world. And in a later book, John Darwin wrote called Unlocking the World, Steam Globalisation and Port Cities, 1830 to, I think, 1930. He really identifies this the technology of steam power, steam boats and railways, as well as the steam engine, as changing fundamentally the geopolitics and globalisation processes around the world. It is in this era that the idea of the West really takes off. It's associated with an idea of 19th century European liberalism that also includes North America and, to some degree, Russia. We see the emergence of a world economy and the expansion of the frontiers of Greater Europe. It's the term he uses for Europe as such, North America, which is in a way a colonised projection out of Europe, as well as Russia, which has many cultural roots in Europe but is then expanding out into Eurasia. But the empires that emerge here between 1830, this is an era of enormous expansion of power. It follows the emergence of the East India Company in India, the subjection of India to British military imperialism. And we also see, however, that even in this time, the dominion of the European powers is really and American powers is relatively limited, and there is a strong effort of self-strengthening, if you like, going on in the other parts of the world, in the Ottoman world, or at least attempts to self-strengthen, a realisation of the comparative advantages of the Euro-Atlantic powers in certain technologies, and an attempt to respond. And in many ways, the story of 19th century China, Japan, the Ottoman Empire and Iran is really told by John Darwin very well. It leads also into the next era, the limits of empire, 1880 to 1914, in which we see the dramatic partition, the division of Africa, of the spoils of Africa by the European powers. And it is really only in this period between 1880 and 1914 that John Darwin says, for the first time in world history, a global hierarchy emerges in which, there is a genuine dominance of the Euro-American powers around the world, but no global hegemon, because there is enormous competitive coexistence between these powers. And we also see the emergence of global economics and perhaps the high point of, race-based ideas of cultural differences between different parts of the world, as well as the weak attempts to, or the continuing efforts to subject East Asia and the Middle East to the European colonial powers, and to some degree the American powers. Of course, then that takes us into what John Darwin innovatively describes not as World War I or World War II, but he says this era between 1914 and 1942 or 1945, his chapter is called Towards the Crisis of the World. We see the incredible two world wars, as well as the many wars in between. The interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, of course, saw many wars. In some ways, the other historian, Richard Overy, who's been profoundly influenced by John Darwin's book After Tamerlane, in his book Blood and Ruins, describes World War II as the last imperial war, 1931 to 1945. But this idea of a crisis of the world occurring in this era, this 30 or 40 year period between, I guess, the era of steam globalization and, I guess, the era of the world of nations in the post-1945 world. And it's very much a very, very fractured world order in which imperialisms are at war. Finally, the final period in John Darwin's narrative is what he calls Empire Denied, 1945 to 2000. It is an ambiguous title for a chapter. It doesn't mean that America denies it is an empire. Doesn't mean an attempt to keep British and other European empires going for a few more generations was denied. Doesn't mean that an attempt to establish a global hegemony of American empire was also denied. But this chapter really conveys a brilliant sense that in 1945 the world was in a terrible state. There was no clear entry into this post-1945 world that people talk about. He says it was like a bombed out city. And he really discusses the partition of Eurasia, which occurs with, I guess, the Cold War. Both Europe is partitioned, the Iron Curtain between Eastern Soviet Union-controlled Europe and Western American, United States-controlled and occupied Europe as well. There is also a partition that occurs at the other end of Eurasia. America really, for the first time in global history, America or a single power entrenches itself at both ends of Eurasia, in Europe and in East Asia or the West Pacific. And we're still living with the consequences of that. The NATO in Europe, the many American military bases in the West Pacific, including in Japan. Here he also talks about decolonisation and the undeclared empire of the United States. And the belief after 1989 or 1991 that America was an unlimited empire. It could do whatever it could do. And that it was the unipolar world. But John Darwin's narrative really ends with a call back to the mistaken belief of the world conqueror Tamerlane that he could actually assert dominion over Eurasia or become a conqueror of the world. He calls back to that and says, in the same way, the American belief that it had established a unipolar order was mistaken. Now, I'm going to be exploring particularly this period of the post-1945 world more extensively in November and December on my Substack at jeffrich.substack.com. So do sign up there to get my sort of deep dives into this remarkable book by John Darwin that really will give you a much better understanding of the history that has shaped the world we live in and that is driving, that reveals the driving forces that are breaking apart the post-1945 world and leading us into something different, something no one can quite agree on what to describe, and perhaps they never will agree on what to describe. Let's just hope it doesn't end in World War III. But I think if you try to make sense of this puzzling world with history with me at jeffrich.substack.com, we can perhaps maybe avoid that consequence. Thanks for watching.